Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The last question Mr. Carter asked Ms. Atkinson was whether or not you thought it would be beneficial to have some standard practice for requiring compliance with these requests, and you said yes, and then you, to paraphrase, you added this little caveat, unless there's a culture that exists to the contrary, to a culture, as I interpret it, to avoid compliance. Is that an accurate assessment of what you said?
Yes, sir. I think it's akin to, the Titanic is sinking and somebody's saying, quick, hurry and rearrange the deck chairs. That won't make much difference in the big picture if the problem that's causing, or the big issue that's causing the problem isn't addressed.
Okay. Ms. Atkinson, Mr. Leopold, Ms. Goodman, you're all investigative reporters. Mr. McGraw, I assume that in your role as Vice President General Counsel, you have some idea about investigative reporting. You all have expressed your frustration in your investigations of various federal agencies in regard to the failure to comply with FOIA requests. Have any of you investigated or considered investigating FOIA violations? And you can answer yes or no.
Yes, sir.
You have? Good.
I've considered it and I've done some of it.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
I not only have investigated it, I've written about it extensively.
Like Mr. Leopold, we have FOIA'd the FOIA record to see how a prior request was being done.
Okay, good. In doing this, then, are you aware of any federal agency being proactive in training employees on methods or tactics for avoiding compliance with FOIA requests?
I noted in my written testimony and my opening statement that the Pentagon has a policy in which FOIA requests that are deemed significant requests get department-level review. In other words, the process is politicized.
Okay, let me be clear. How about a federal agency actually conducting a session to train their employees how to work with non-government groups so as to do government business outside official government infrastructure and communications channels? We had a hearing in the Science Committee back in March, and one of the witnesses who testified is a former EPA employee, David Schneier. And he brought this up, and I have a copy of his testimony here. He talked about the EPA prepared an 83-page PowerPoint presentation on how to use electronic tools to collaborate with external partners. This presentation encourages use of instant messaging, other real-time correspondence tools, and even encourages using AOL and Yahoo and asking third parties to set up chat rooms. He went on to say, but this presentation also documents the culture, Ms. Atkinson, of disregard for agency duties under public records and FOIA requirements. It characterizes FOIA and NARA rules as federal laws that constrain federal administration of public-facing web collaboration tools. I have a printed copy of the PowerPoint here. He says the next section of the presentation describes creative solutions to dealing with federal constraints. And here are the federal constraints that they mentioned: National Archives and Records Administration, Federal Advisory Committee Act, Paperwork Reduction Act, National Institute of Standards and Technology, and others. He says that specifically EPA encourages its employees to help outside parties to sponsor the web-based collaboration tools, noting that as long as we are only participants, not administrators of a web collaboration site, the site is not limited by those same FOIA and Public Records Act constraints. How would you respond to that, Mr. Leopold?
You'll have to forgive me, but I'm completely confused about that. I'm not quite sure what he's saying there. So I'm not well informed about this idea or proposal.
Ms. Atkinson is eager to respond. So
Well, I understand what you're saying, sir, and I think, and I cut it from my verbal testimony for time, but there are new tactics, even if FOIA is shored up. We've already seen that agencies, and I've written some on this, and officials instruct subordinates to not put things in emails, to use instant messaging. Sometimes they use private service, private emails, pseudonyms, friends' accounts, and all kinds of other ways that even this problem would be
that are
solved.
not subject to a FOIA request.
Yes, sir.
Or any other public records request. I think, what I'm saying here, Mr. Chairman, if I may, is that you have a former EPA employee who, in testimony, sworn testimony, just in March, talked about what I consider a conspiratorial effort to avoid complying with federal records. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman.
Mr. Fenton, in regard to the memo from the White House that Mr. Jordan read, in which they directed every executive agency to notify them of any request for information. And in the context of your answer to a question Mr. Heiss just asked about, in which you responded as criminal obstruction, that's pretty strong. I want to know what you would think about an agency possibly engaging in an effort to instruct their employees on how to work with outside groups to avoid the requirements of a FOIA request.
Well, it certainly would be inappropriate. The Justice Department is the locus of evil when it comes to FOIA noncompliance. All the agencies get represented by the Justice Department, and everything they say and everything they do in terms of withholding is almost always supported by the Justice Department. I would bring the Attorney General or a representative up from Justice and say, tell us those cases that you've turned away.
Let me share with you some information that I shared with the panel earlier from the press. This is the written testimony submitted by Mr. David Schneier, former employee of the EPA, who testified that the EPA had prepared an 83-page PowerPoint presentation on how to use electronic tools to collaborate with external partners. I'm not going to read all of this, but he talked about the use of instant messaging, other real-time correspondence tools, even encouraging using AOL and Yahoo and asking third parties to set up chat rooms. And then here's the part I find particularly troublesome. He said, this presentation also documents the culture of disregard for agency duties under public records and FOIA requirements. It characterizes FOIA and the NARA rules as federal laws that constrain federal administration of public-facing web collaboration tools. That's actually, here's the PowerPoint from that.
Yeah,
and listed among those, let me,
Yeah, go ahead,
is the NARA, the Federal Advisory Committee Act, the Paperwork Reduction Act. I mean, this, and then he goes on and says, the next section of the presentation describes creative solutions to dealing with federal constraints. Now, they've already considered these requests for documents to be constraints and openly suggest ways to circumvent public records acts. Specifically, EPA encourages its employees to help outside parties to sponsor the web-based collaboration tools, noting that as long as we're only participants, not administrators of a web collaboration site, the site is not limited by those same FOIA and Public Records Act constraints. How would you respond to that? How would you characterize that? Let me say that. Put it that way.
Well, that's willful. That's a willful avoidance of the law, and their criminal law already prevents. There's a criminal sanction for willful concealment of documents, and the classification issues with a process like that are significant. You could have classified records depending on the agency, and to be creating federal records and not maintaining them in a willful way is a criminal violation of law. And you know, this is a dramatic illustration of a coordinated effort to avoid transparency laws and disclosure.
So that would perhaps go beyond obstruction.
Well, when I say obstruction, when there is a willful concealment of records, you're violating the Freedom of Information Act, but there are criminal sanctions associated with concealing records, and that has got to be a tool that prosecutors, you know, they can do a case against the former Speaker of the House by interpreting the structuring laws, the anti-structuring laws. Maybe they can figure out how to do the criminal laws and impose them on the federal bureaucracy that willfully violate FOIA in ways that take away our freedom to know what our government's up to.
Would any of the other panel like to respond to that?
I'd add that it's very widespread.
I would also add that LinkedIn is something to be looked into. It's probably because the FOIAs are so slow that didn't make it to that. I mean, they talked about Yahoo Messenger or something ridiculous like that. But indeed, LinkedIn has sold $500,000 of contracts, and I went to a training for government officers, and they were specifically told to use their private email accounts to be able to communicate with people.